So hydrocarbons are these chains of carbon and hydrogen, and they can have double bonds and triple bonds, and they can be rings. But what really makes the different compounds in living things, carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids, what makes each one unique is not just the hydrocarbons, but the fact that the carbon and hydrogen are joined by these special covalently bonded groups of elements called functional groups. And there are 8 of them that we're going to talk about in here, and you will not need to be able to draw them, but you will need to be able to recognize them. And not only recognize them just by themselves, but associate them with the proper organic compound. So these are them: hydroxyl, a carbonyl, which is, there's 2, ketone and aldehyde, carboxyl, amino, selfhydral, also called a thiol, phosphate, methyl, and ester. So on the next few slides, we are going to go through each of these. So if you're using the outline, you do not need this. The ball and stick model is not necessary. What you're going to want to draw in the boxes that you're going to want to memorize is the molecular structure of the functional group, like the Lewis structure, if you recall from chemistry. So our first one is hydroxyl, which is an OH. This is not a charge, this is a bond. So the way I'm going to write these on the next slides is I'm going to show them like this, connected, and you'll see the letter R. Now, just so you know, R is not an element. What R represents is the hydrocarbon. In other words, this is where the functional group is attaching. So this could be a long chain of carbons, this could be a ring of carbons, whatever it may be. But what we're saying is, it's sort of like a variable in algebra. R is the carbon point where this is attached. So OH is your hydroxyl group. And things that have an OH are called alcohols. And you don't have to know that. At the bottom here, and on each of these slides, you're going to see an example. You don't need to know the specific example, but this is what it might look like if you were to see the functional group on an actual carbon chain. So here's the hydroxyl group, and it is attached to a carbon. And this one happens to be ethanol, which you may recall we were working with in the water lab last week. We were looking at ethanol versus water and how many drops fit on a penny and how quickly it heated and all that. So that's ethanol. And all alcohols actually have this particular functional group. So it's called a hydroxyl, and again, for purposes of your notes, this is what you need to know, this, at the top. All right, so our second group is called a carbonyl, and carbonyl really refers to a carbon double bonded to oxygen. However, there are 2 specific carbonyls, and it has to do with where this carbon double bonded to oxygen is attached, where it is in the carbon chain. And so in your notes, I have 2 separate things there. And I'm not sure which order they're in, but I'm going to do the ketone first. So it's called a ketone if the carbon that's double attached to the oxygen is somewhere in the chain, like this. So remember, we were using the letter R to represent our carbon attachment points. And so this is what a ketone would look like. It does not have to be exactly in the middle. You'll see this picture of acetone on the left, which is an example of a ketone. It wouldn't have to be exactly in the middle. It could be a carbon double bonded to oxygen, and then there's a carbon here, and then there's 5 carbons over here. This would still be a ketone, even though it's not symmetrically right in the middle. The other one is called an aldehyde. Aldehyde is where the carbon is double bonded to oxygen is on the end of a carbon chain. So again, here's our ketone. The carbon double bonded to oxygen, it's connected to carbons on either side, and these would be a chain or a ring or whatever. Here's an aldehyde here. So here's your carbon chain, and your carbon double bonded to oxygen, and just a hydrogen to fill that 4th bond that carbon has to make. So this is your aldehyde, just C double bonded to O and an H. And then your ketone, C double bonded to O, but in the middle somewhere of a carbon chain. So that's the difference. Again, ketone is the one here on the left, right here. That's your ketone in the middle. And then aldehyde, it's on the end. So here, carbon, oxygen, hydrogen. All right, and after a while, some of these look very, very similar. So I hope that you will use the Quizlets that I've provided and start learning these. Use little flashcards and learn these. All right, so our next one, notice this looks very similar to the ketone and the aldehyde because there's a carbon double bonded to oxygen. This is called a carboxyl group. It is also sometimes called, because of its behavior, it can behave as an acid. It can sometimes be called a carboxylic acid group. Now, here's the thing on this one. If they don't have a lot of space, they might just write COOH. In other words, they're writing out the elements that are in it without drawing its 3D structure, its Lewis structure. Or you could see a picture of a molecule like this one where they have shown the 3D structure, where it's a C showing that it's double bonded to the oxygen, and then that same carbon is connected to an OH. And the angles, by the way, for purposes of our class, the angles are not important. We're not going to be talking about bond angles. So it would also be okay if you saw it drawn like this. Sometimes they draw it, with these angles because that's technically more appropriate for the real bond angles of the molecule. But this would be okay also. If you saw this in a drawing, what you want to recognize is this. C double bonded to oxygen, and then also connected to OH. Or, again, in a shorthand version, that, COOH. And the picture at the bottom is showing acetic acid, which is what vinegar is composed of. And it's showing how carboxyl group can behave as an acid, how it can give away a hydrogen. And remember, that's our definition of acids. There are things that give up hydrogens in solution. All right, so that's our carboxyl or carboxylic acid group. Our next one is called an amino group. So an amino group, again, could be written if they were not doing it three-dimensionally. They might show it sticking off of a molecule, and they might just write NH2, because that is the formula for it. Or they could draw it out. So here's the drawn out version showing how the two hydrogens are coming off of the nitrogen. And again, you might see the drawing this way, where those hydrogens are drawn here and here instead of actually being drawn at the other angle. The angles, for purposes of what we're doing, are not important. What's important is that you could recognize these compounds in a diagram. And I'll show you an example right at the end of what I mean by that. All right, moving on. So that's our amine or amino group. Our next one's called a selfhydral, or it's sometimes called a thiol or a thiol. And it's really easy. It's literally just sulfur and hydrogen, just SH. There's no three-dimensional structure or anything like that. And actually, this example at the bottom is a good example of what I mean by recognizing these functional groups. So if we look at our example at the bottom, here's our thiol or our sulfhydral group. But you could be given a picture like this, and you could be asked, circle or told to circle an amino group on this. And you would be expected to know that this is an amino group. Or you could have this with a letter next to it, and they could say, what functional group is that? Well, that's a carboxyl group or a carboxylic acid group. So this is the kind of thing, the application that you might see. You might see the functional group by itself, or you could see it in the diagram of some molecule and then be asked to locate a particular functional group, identify it, circle it, something like that. Or you could be given a particular compound like an amino acid or a phospholipid or a nucleotide, which we haven't talked about any of those yet, and you could be actually asked, to recognize that by which functional groups are found in it, because certain functional groups are unique to particular macromolecules that we're going to be talking about. All right, our next one is phosphate. Again, this is going to be, the shorthand way would just be PO4 connected to an organic compound, some kind of compound. Or it could be drawn out like this. So you can actually see that the oxygen is the connector here, and it's a phosphorus surrounded by 4 oxygens. Notice there's one double bond, and these are actually charges. Again, you're not going to have to draw them. So recognizing the fact that there's charges or the double bond, it's not that important. In fact, phosphate's one of the easiest ones to identify because the name phospho tells you phosphorus, and so it kind of tells you what it is. So it should be easier to find. Notice here, this particular thing has 2 hydroxyl groups on it as well. So there's another example of where you might be asked to recognize a particular functional group from a drawing. All right, the next one is a methyl group. So a methyl group is CH3. Again, the shorthand way would just be CH3. Or the three-dimensional drawing you might see would be this, where it actually shows the three hydrogens, how they're connected to that R group, the whatever carbon chain that is. And methyl is very interesting because we'll talk about this when we get to genetics. There's this layer of genetics called epigenetics, and it's all about not just what DNA you have, but these switches that turn your DNA off and on. And that controls all kinds of things. Your aging is linked to that. Certain cancers are linked to that. And methyl groups, when they're attached to certain areas on DNA, they turn DNA off. So we could control the activity of DNA by purposely putting methyl groups on or taking them off of a section of DNA. We could control whether that particular DNA is active or whether it's dormant. So it's kind of interesting, and we'll be coming back to it later. But there's the diagram of the methyl group.